But let's talk about India now in 2012, because I remember the last time I had this conversation with you in March of last year, you were looking at the market, you were studying it, you were saying that there are opportunities, long term it's a structurally good story.
Like last year we were looking at the market, we thought it was not particularly cheap, not particularly expensive when we last spoke, and then the sort of perfect storm came along. Policy uncertainty regarding the measures in Parliament, the tension between, on the one hand, containing the fiscal deficit and containing inflation, and then the turmoil in Europe and in the US. It set it all up. Combine that with some quite significant issuance in equity and debt markets coming out of India, and we had, as you said, a very significant sell-off of around 25% in equities, and add on top of that a very significant weakness of the currencies. This has first made the market a whole lot cheaper in an unchanged world.
Yeah, because there was a consensus underweight.
There was a consensus underweight, and this is what sort of happened. So from a valuation perspective, it looks much more attractive. From a currency perspective, as already mentioned to you, again, it looks much more attractive. And from a policy perspective, do I expect a dramatic turnaround in inflation, in the fiscal dynamics, in the current account dynamics in India overnight tomorrow? The answer to that is no. But clearly we are now being rewarded much more for taking those risks than we were 6 months ago. So we like it. We like the banks. The credit extension story in India, I think, remains a very, very powerful one. We like retail. I think the retail sector is going to do quite well. And it is a market that, from an absolute and relative valuation perspective right now, looks much more compelling than it did 6 to 9 months ago.
But if you see a market falling 25%, how much, given the macro scenario or the political uncertainty and the pace of reform slowing down, how much is feasible, or how much is the expected return or bounce back that you foresee from a market only on a technical basis?
In emerging markets equities, the market never goes down 5% and never goes up 5%. It's either down 25 or up 25, and it always overshoots both ways. We clearly had an overshoot on the downside, and I would not be surprised if we now see an overshoot on the upside. We've already had 10%, add another 20, 30%. Let's go back to the analogy that we discussed earlier of 2009. In the beginning of 2009, emerging markets equities dropped 30% before they doubled. So the move can be quite violent. The minute we see a stabilization of economic activity in the G7, inflation being relatively contained, I think we'll see, we've just seen the beginning of that rally.
Sectors, and you spoke about retail, you spoke about financials. Let me touch upon financials first. How do you see or evaluate the banking sector as is today, from a valuation perspective and from a growth perspective?
From a valuation perspective, much cheaper than they were. From a broader perspective, as we are now going back to an environment where really the banking system in a country like India is the summary statistic of economic progress in the country. This is where the ultimate credit extension in the economy, from micro lending all the way to lending to large enterprises, that is really the credit intermediation engine. Now that the world is stabilizing again, banks can focus again on growing those businesses. As they typically do in emerging markets, they will do it again, and I think that's going to be quite supportive.
Asset quality concerns don't worry you?
In fast-growing economies, it is close to impossible to grow the books of banks without at some point a hiccup in the asset quality of some of their credit extension. However, that in itself is highly cyclical, and I expect the rebound in economic activity globally to be supportive of that.
So would you be looking at the big marquee names in the public sector or private sector space, or would you also be looking at some of the regional, some of the mid-tier banking names?
We look more at the bigger names, but that is primarily because our funds have very much a focus on liquidity. So we want to be in the most liquid names, and is in no way a reflection of some of the smaller institutions that I'm sure are doing quite well.
You also mentioned retail. Is there a bit of a disappointment there on the situation as far as foreign direct investment is concerned? Yeah, I mean, measures are being taken, but it's not happening as fast as expected.
Deregulating retail markets, allowing foreign entrants in those markets, with the expertise that they bring, with the efficiency gains that they bring, is in all countries in the world a very slow process. If you look at France, if you look at Belgium, it's taken them 10, 20, 30 years to really effectively deregulate the opening hours of stores. Add to that the challenges of the size of the economy, the political implications that come with the fast growth that the economy is going through. I am not surprised this is a process that takes time. This is not to justify the procrastination in not moving the process forward faster. But the challenges are generally significant from a political and economic perspective. It's a stop-start process, you know, a couple of steps forward, a couple of steps backwards. But on the whole, I do believe that the deregulation that is so badly needed will ultimately happen.
You know, the average allocations for emerging markets in global portfolios, you told me last time that it would be about 12 to 13% and will go up sizably. Do you think 2012 will be the year when we see that shift happen, and how much would that increment be? And secondly, how much of that allocation would come down to India?
There is no doubt in my mind that for large global portfolios managers to increase their allocation to emerging markets to let's say 20%, there is no way they can achieve that target without a significant allocation to India. It's one of the largest countries, it's one of the most important ones, it's one of the dominant economies in the world economy now and will continue to be so and becoming more so over the next 20, 30 years. So the notion that they can achieve that target by going to smaller countries with little allocation to India, I think is just not feasible. To your question of whether 2012 is going to be the year where it is going to happen, we had a setback in the second half of last year. Clearly, emerging markets did not serve as the safe haven as particularly European equity portfolios generally suffered. But at the same time, the basic valuation premise is still there, and there is now a better entry point. So I do think this is the year where we're going to make very significant progress towards that goal.
$15 billion was the kind of fund outflow we saw from BRIC funds last year. You think all of that money is coming back this year?
Not only will it come back, it will come back with a vengeance and more.
All right, Bart, we'll leave it at that. Thanks very much for joining us and giving us your perspective.
Thank you very much,
on the situation.